This should have been a straightforward restoration of a vintage Mac that's popular among enthusiasts. And it was, until it all went wrong when I least expected it. After having repaired my first Mac SE30 some time ago and effectively building one from scratch since then, I ended up with yet another in need of restoration. I was told it didn't want to boot, which is a problem with a pretty wide range of causes. This one looked to be in good shape, at least on the outside, but that doesn't mean there weren't any horrors lying within. I plugged it in and turned it on to find it seemed to be okay, at least so far. It did give me the blinking question mark to indicate it couldn't find an OS to boot, and something strange I noticed was that the hard drive activity LED was lit solid. So I plugged in an external Blue SCSI, a solid-state hard drive replacement, along with a keyboard and mouse, and it booted without a problem. I was optimistic this could be an easy fix. The screen was clear and bright, and the system reported having 5 megabytes of RAM. But I realized it never made a startup sound, so I power cycled it to check again. Nope, no signature startup beep, so I'd have to look into that. And this time, instead of booting from the Blue SCSI, the machine got stuck, seemingly frozen at the disk icon but without the blinking question mark. And the hard drive LED was lit solid again. Time to take a look inside. The back corner of the machine featured an optional accessory called the programmer's switch. It gave you easier access to the motherboard's reset and interrupt buttons for debugging programs, but a lot of owners installed them for convenience in case the system crashed. It needs to come off because otherwise the two pieces that press the takt switches inside would get broken when you remove the case. A pair of Torx screws secure the back of the case at the bottom, and they're easy enough to remove. But the other two are tucked inside the handle at the top, which makes them difficult to take out unless you have a hilariously long screwdriver bit like this. A lot of times the case halves can still be stuck together, and a trick I learned is to leave one of the screws partially threaded, then push down on the screwdriver while simultaneously pulling up on the back of the case. That's usually enough to pop it free. As I was suspecting, there's still a hard drive inside this machine, and it's very likely dead. My hunch is that it's causing the SCSI bus to sometimes get hung up, which makes the system freeze and fail to boot. Taking it out is a bit involved because of how tightly packed everything is inside, but I'd need to take a look at all these parts anyway, especially the motherboard. The hard drive is mounted to a bracket on the floppy drive, so both need to come out together. These floppy drives often need a bit of maintenance to get working again, which I'll deal with later. It's not really feasible to repair these old SCSI hard drives, especially since failures are becoming increasingly common with no repair parts available. So I simply pulled it out so it could get recycled. It's definitely an original drive, a 40 megabyte unit made by Quantum. These were optional in the SE30. The base model came without a hard drive at all, and the high-end offered 80 megabytes of capacity. Here's a hopeful sign. The retaining clip for the clock, or PRAM battery, has been taped to the expansion card bracket. And as I'd hoped, that meant the battery was missing, taken out before it had a chance to do any damage. These tend to leak and wreak havoc, often rendering the motherboard unrepairable. That's the reason why I built that custom SE30. I got a so-called battery-bombed board and, well, things kinda got out of hand. That doesn't mean this board didn't need some attention though. It still has electrolytic capacitors that leak over time, and these definitely looked like the originals. It's a good idea to replace them, so I removed the ROM and RAM modules in preparation. I had to be extra careful as this board uses slots with plastic retaining latches, which get brittle and break from age. I chose to approach the recap from the perspective of someone without any specialty soldering tools. And to me, that means the safest method of removing the old caps is to cut them off the board. first by snipping them in half, then carefully lifting away what's left so the legs remain soldered in place. Sometimes corrosion from leaked electrolyte means the whole thing will pop free. Some folks swear by twisting the whole cap off the board, and if you're one of them, you've probably already voiced your opinion in the comments. Cutting the caps off just seems less risky to me. There was definitely some leakage mixed in with the dust, but it wasn't nearly as bad as I was expecting. I cleaned the area around the solder pads with some isopropyl alcohol, then applied flux and used desoldering braid to remove the remains of the capacitor legs and clean the pads. What's nice is that if the pads show some corrosion, the braid is often abrasive enough to remove it. Sometimes looks can be deceiving though, and a seemingly clean pad may not accept solder very well, in which case careful scraping with a scalpel may be necessary. I like to use solid tantalum capacitors as replacements, and to install them I apply solder to one pad, then slide the cap into place. Tantalums won't leak over time like caps with liquid electrolyte usually do, but aren't impervious to failures. I still think they're a good choice, not just because of their longevity, but also because they're, well, a lot easier to work with. Others have different preferences though, and that's okay too. With the surface mount caps replaced, next up were the two axial through-hole parts. You could use a desoldering iron to remove them like I did, but even with one, you're still going to fight the heat-sinking properties of the board's ground plane. Removing these cleanly is time-consuming and not fun, so instead, I'd recommend simply clipping the leads and soldering the new caps to them. I happen to have one of the necessary parts on hand, which is good because axial capacitors aren't used very often anymore, so they're becoming harder to find. For the other one, I had to use a normal radial part instead, which will work fine but means you have to bend the legs to make it fit. With those done, I could give the whole board a good cleaning by soaking it in isopropyl alcohol. An ultrasonic cleaner would be ideal, but I don't have one, nor the space to store it. So a solid scrubbing with a soft toothbrush and letting it sit for a few hours is usually sufficient. After letting the board dry for a day, I was ready to test it out. The ROM module went back in, as did some of the RAM, but not all. The 5 megabytes the system reported was not a stock amount, and here's why. 4 of these modules are only 256 kilobytes each. They're a bit weird too. They're from Texas Instruments, and on the back say they were made in Japan. But below that it says assembled in with USA inked over and Singapore silk-screened on. Okay, fine, maybe that means the RAM chips are Japanese and they were put on the PCB in Singapore. But flip the module over and the chips were made in Singapore too. What do you think's going on here? A neat trick to test the motherboard outside the case is to use a standard ATX cable extender. It plugs into the stock wiring harness and the unused pins neatly hang off the motherboard's connector. I fired it up and it all looked good, so the recap was a success. Another common problem with the SE30 and its predecessor, the SE, is the power supply. It's attached to the analog board which drives the CRT and has capacitors that commonly fail too. After discharging the CRT, I went to unscrew the analog board to find that one was missing. That's strange because taking these out isn't necessary to upgrade the RAM. Maybe they forgot to install it to begin with, which is a more plausible explanation than you may think. In 1989, when the SE30 was introduced, Apple used robots to assemble circuit boards, but putting together the rest of the computer was done by hand. Several manufacturers made power supplies for this model, with this one coming from Sony. After pulling the board out, things didn't look too bad, and we had already established that it did at least work. But like with the motherboard, it's not a matter of if, but when these capacitors will fail, so I got them all swapped out. This kind of work is where having a desoldering iron becomes very worthwhile. The only cap I didn't replace is the big one on the AC side, as they don't fail very often. Before I started work on this power supply, I did check the voltage on it, because these can hold a pretty decent charge for a while that would not be fun to get shocked by. And for that matter, if you aren't comfortable working on power supplies, then don't. The good news is that there's a number of easy drop-in replacements you can use instead. I chose not to recap the analog board this time. There aren't many caps here to begin with, and in my experience, failures aren't very common. So everything went back together, though I've always found reinstalling the analog board to be a trickier affair than it should be. You can tell they were trying to pack as much into this compact chassis as they could. I plugged it in one more time to make sure the PSU was fine, but nothing showed up on screen. That's not good, yet when I tested the voltages, they looked great.
There's no way.
Just to be sure, I checked the brightness knob.
Are you for real?
That's a dumb mistake I think anyone working on these Macs ends up making at least once. After blowing the dust out of the chassis, I wiped down the internal ribbon cables and checked out the floppy drive. This one, mechanically at least, seemed to be fine. Often they need fresh grease to work smoothly, so we'll test it out later and go from there. In place of the dead mechanical hard drive, I chose to install a BlueSCSI, which has been my go-to these days. They use an SD card for storage and have a solid feature set, so they've become quite popular. I wanted to keep the original hard drive bracket because it also holds the activity LED, but mounting the BlueSCSI to that would make it inconvenient to access the SD card slot. 3D printing to the rescue. I had previously designed an adapter that mounts to the machine's expansion card bracket. I've included a link to the model down in the description. The BlueSCSI has a header for the activity LED, so I used some jumper leads to extend the wiring, since the original ones weren't quite long enough. Next up was the RAM. 5 megabytes wasn't quite enough for me, so I dug through my parts bin to find other modules to fill the slots those 256K sticks were in. These claim to be 1 meg each, which would give me a total of 8, enough breathing room for the OS and several applications. In place of the normal PRAM battery, I went with one of these, a clever adapter. It snaps into the stock battery holder and accepts a CR2032 coin cell, which are less prone to leaking. And that was it. I was feeling pretty good while I reassembled the machine. All the work I'd done had been successful and went much smoother than I'd expected. Though I did run into a bit of an issue while reinstalling the motherboard. It wouldn't fit. I found that the new RAM sticks I'd installed were just a bit too tall and hit the metal chassis. Back to the parts bin I went to find my only other bag of 30-pin RAM. Some of these were obviously small capacity modules, but these denser ones showed promise. They didn't have any labels indicating their size, but a quick search of the part numbers suggested each chip was 512K. 8 chips per module with a 9th for parity meant these were 4 meg sticks. Now we're talking. The SE30 is a bit of a weird machine, which is probably why people like it so much. It has complex RAM requirements, like the order that modules have to be installed. This meant I needed to put those 4 meg sticks in first, then the original 1 meg sticks afterwards. This is because the machine was basically a powerful Mac II-X desktop with 16 MHz 68030 processor shrunken down into a compact Mac footprint. They were workhorse computers when they were new, and these days they're desirable among collectors for their speed and expandability. Not to mention their late 80s charm. This one cleaned up very well. Whoever had it clearly took good care of it. Then I went to drop an SD card into the BlueSCSI, but...
Oh, damn it!
Yeah, I forgot to pop out the expansion slot cover. But then I could hook everything up and hopefully be done with the restoration. It all went as it should. The machine detected the BlueSCSI and offered to format it, then I could install a copy of System 7. With 20 megabytes of RAM, it performed well, but then I was reminded I needed to change a setting. See how it says the OS is taking up over 13 megs of RAM? That's because the system is running in 24-bit addressing mode, which means it can't access anything beyond 8 megs. It's easy to fix, you just need to head into the memory control panel and turn on 32-bit addressing, except it's not here. Oh, that's right, the SE30 is one of a few Macs where the hardware can support 32-bit addressing, but its ROM prevents it. There's a couple of options for this. A lot of enthusiasts like to install modern replacement ROM modules, which contain code that's so-called 32-bit clean, along with offering other features. But there was an alternative back in the day, and it's a control panel called Mode 32. It was written by a prolific Mac software publisher called Connectix, and basically patched some of the ROM code when the Mac booted. Mode 32 was such a popular tool that Apple ended up licensing it so it could be given away for free. Once it's enabled and you reboot the Mac, the option to turn on 32-bit addressing shows up in the memory control panel. And one more reboot later, the Mac can use more than 8 megs of RAM, with the OS consuming a much smaller amount, like it should. One last hardware test. How about that floppy drive? Looks like it can read disks just fine, and it ejects them smoothly too. Awesome. With this SE30 restored and working great, I left it running for about an hour while I worked on something else. But when I came back, I found the screen was garbled, and a reboot didn't fix it. I left the machine powered off overnight thinking maybe heat was a factor, but nope. The video was permanently messed up now. This thing was working fine. What happened? Clearly, my restoration journey wasn't quite over yet. When troubleshooting, I like to follow the principle of divide and conquer. Try to split the problem in half and focus on one side at a time. In this case, the video issue could be either from the motherboard or the analog board. I hate doing it, but I used my known good SE30 as a way to figure out which one it was. I plugged its motherboard into the broken machine's chassis, and the video looked normal. Okay, that means it's a motherboard issue. There are several chips that handle the video circuitry in the SE30, and I focused on the socketed ones first, since they'd be the easiest. That bodge wire is a factory addition and expected to be there, so don't worry about it. The video ROM was the first thing to swap over from my known good board, but that didn't make a difference. So next I switched out the PAL chips, but no dice there either. With the SE30 being picky about RAM, I figured that maybe those new modules I added could be the problem. But with just the original 4 megabytes installed, there was no change. TechNight over on Tinker Different pointed me towards this row of surface mount chips, as some of them are responsible for muxing the video data. There's no way in hell I was stealing the chips off my good board though, so I pulled out a parts one. It was left over from when I did that crazy clear SE30 build sent my way by Kai Robinson to help troubleshooting. It had been recapped by someone who, for some reason, used through-hole parts on everything. But it did work, at least until I stole a couple components from it. So I applied some flux and used my hot air station to remove that whole row of chips to transfer over. These kinds of repairs can be tedious, especially if you're not sure they're gonna work. I replaced 2 of the chips to start, labeled UF8 and UG8. My soldering skills aren't amazing, but with the help of the microscope and good flux, I think I did a serviceable job. Was one of those 2 chips the culprit? Nope, and I was getting discouraged. I replaced the rest of the chips along that row. They're adjacent to a capacitor, so electrolyte leakage can be a problem, but none of them or their paths looked horrible, and they had worked for at least an hour. If it was one of these, it would have been due to component failure and not a poor connection due to corrosion. Time for the moment of truth. Was that it?
Woohoo!
Oh, what a relief. Things look normal now. Admittedly, it would have been nice to know which specific chip went bad, but that would have taken much longer, and honestly, if one failed, it's possible others would have followed. It was one of 5 chips, and that's close enough for me. Even though this is a model I've explored a few times before, working on these never gets old. The same is true of other vintage computers too. Each has its own set of needs and problems to keep you on your toes and presents an opportunity to learn. So even though repairs can seem mundane and repetitive, there are often little twists to make things exciting. If you liked the video, I'd appreciate a thumbs up and be sure to subscribe. Here's another episode you should check out, and as always, thanks for watching.